Today, I'm going to tell you about the dark secret my friend Ilara hasn't been able to share with anyone for years. This story is inspired by a real event, but Ilara still doesn't know how much of what she lived was real and how much of it was her mind playing tricks on her. Near Asheville, North Carolina, in that old farmhouse. On the day she went to visit her aunt Vivian, she learned that her uncle-in-law Arthur was after something far darker than a treasure buried in the ground. As a child, she thought his oddities were just a harmless obsession. That is, until Vivian finally revealed all the truths she had been hiding for years. Arthur was a short, chubby-faced man who was always sweating. He always wore leather jackets and old boots. He acted as if he were ready to head to a dig site at any moment. Ilara's childhood memories were full of her Uncle Arthur's gleaming, fanatical eyes. Arthur would always repeat the same thing. "One day, I'm going to be rich. I'll rescue my family from this miserable life." Arthur's obsession had long since stopped being a simple hobby and turned into a dangerous sickness. On weekends, he would disappear with old, worn maps and a metal detector, going each time to places that were more deserted, more remote, darker. Vivian was constantly ashamed because of her husband and deeply disappointed. Arthur, on the other hand, saw every metal scrap and old coin he found as a sign that a great treasure was drawing near. But Arthur's fanaticism wasn't only about material things. He was also an extremely religious man, yet his religiosity was a weird mix of superstition and dark mysticism. Arthur constantly recited prayers, stuffed little leather pouches with charms and so-called protective talismans. He would hand them out to anyone in need, usually in exchange for a small donation. Even back then, Ilara knew Arthur was a charlatan, an easy prey for con artists, and indeed, Arthur was swindled repeatedly. Fake mediums who sold him treasure maps, and phony geologists who claimed they knew where the treasure was. Every time, Arthur poured all his savings into these scams and came home with nothing but broken dreams and even bigger debts. Vivian forgave him every time, but her faith and love for her husband was slowly fading. One evening at dinner time, Arthur slammed a leather-bound handwritten notebook full of scrawled notes down onto the table, breathing hard. His voice trembled as he spoke. "I found it." Arthur's eyes were shining. The great treasure, thousands of years old, not just gold, a cursed treasure. It has guardians too. Vivian rolled her eyes. "Again, Arthur. Last week you were saying you found Confederate gold." Arthur replied with a mocking smile. "No, Vivian, this is different. This is a treasure guarded by an ancient demon. To take it, you need more than a shovel. You need faith and soul. I need a spiritual guide." He paused for a moment. The fire in his eyes flared even brighter. "The man who gave me this information said the treasure lies beneath ancient ruins in Jordan." He paused, his voice lowering, suddenly sharper. "Great risk and great reward." The hunger in Arthur's eyes had turned into pure madness. In Ilara's mind, those words were the first sprout of a dark seed planted in her uncle's soul. No one could have imagined where this obsession would drag him, or how terrifying his return would be. Arthur Pendleton was determined to do what he had set his mind on. His family's objections and Vivian's pleas were now nothing but empty noise to him. He had snapped. The only thing he could see was that ancient wealth waiting for him beneath the Jordanian desert. Arthur planned the journey in total secrecy. In the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, when international travel was at its riskiest, he left home without telling anyone. When Vivian woke up in the morning, she realized only a few of her husband's belongings were missing. Seeing that he hadn't even left a farewell note shattered her. The only thing Arthur left behind was a worn manuscript on the table, covered in Arabic script. Arthur arrived in Amman and met other treasure hunters he had found on the internet. These men intended to take advantage of Arthur's naive and devout appearance. They told him that reaching the treasure required nothing but strong faith and continuous prayer, and convinced Arthur to take on the role of spiritual guide. "This treasure is guarded by a demon," said one of the men holding the map. "Demons fear everything sacred." The man stepped closer to Arthur and continued, "While we run the excavation, you stand and pray non-stop. You're the Hodja, Arthur. You'll protect us from evil." Arthur felt honored to take on this role. He truly believed he was special, blessed. The other men, Simon and Mark, were in fact experienced con artists. Using a fraction of the money Arthur had brought, they funded both the digging equipment and the fake maps. The group set out for a little-known barren region of Jordan. After several days of arduous travel, they reached an old, sand-covered, crumbling ruin. The ruins seemed to carry a curse untouched for thousands of years, and the place radiated a malevolent energy. The dig began. Arthur perched on a large rock beside the uneven ground. In his hands was an old Bible, clearly read countless times. He began repeating the same prayers over and over where he sat. Simon and Mark dug the earth, exhausted and sweating, but each stroke of their shovels sent Arthur into a deeper trance. In his eyes, this was a holy war. He had to protect the treasure and the team that respected it from evil. As the excavation progressed, the air began to change and grow colder. At night, strong winds blowing in from the desert seemed to carry strange whispering voices. Simon and Mark were growing more and more uneasy. They felt they were getting closer to the treasure, but at the same time, an invisible, heavy threat was settling over them. One of the nights they worked at full speed. Arthur was in a trance, repeating the prayers he had recited thousands of times. Just as hope was beginning to fade, a sharp metallic echo came from beneath the dig site. They had found it. Simon and Mark looked at each other in wild excitement. They hurriedly cleared away the last layer of fine soil. Seconds later, in the hole before them, there lay a rusty yet imposing, ornately carved chest. Arthur's voice, which had been self-assured, suddenly turned into an uncontrolled tremor. His prayers dissolved into meaningless, guttural sounds. A shadow rose like smoke from inside the chest, growing in volume and latched onto Arthur's throat, cutting off his breath. Simon and Mark noticed neither the horrific change in Arthur nor the strange shadow. The only thing that mattered to them was finally reaching the treasure they had waited for all these years. Without wasting time, they each grabbed an end of the heavy, jammed lid and forced it open with great effort. As soon as the chest was opened, a terrifying wind burst forth, something not entirely comprehensible. First, there was a hair-raising scream, followed by a roar as fierce as a sandstorm. Arthur never finished his last prayers that night. His eyes rolled back, turning completely white, and he toppled from the rock like a weightless log. It was as if the darkness inside the chest had suddenly yanked his soul out of his body. Arthur was no longer the man he had once been. That ancient, malevolent being that had touched him had shredded his mind and body, leaving nothing in his place. What happened in the desert after the chest was opened remained a total mystery. Did Simon and Mark make it out alive? Did they manage to take the treasure? No one knows. The only thing known for certain is that Arthur Pendleton was the only one who returned from those ruins, alone and shattered. Somehow, days after he'd left, Arthur managed to return from Jordan to America. That journey back, like the rest of his life from then on, was dark and uncertain. The man who knocked on Vivian's door was less her husband and more an empty shell carrying his body. Vivian had never been as happy about anything as she was seeing Arthur again. She still loved her husband, even if that love had diminished, and she was grateful he was alive. But her happiness was short-lived, because the moment she looked closely at his face, a wave of horror mixed with disgust knocked the breath out of her. Arthur's face was far beyond the wear and tear caused by desert sun and exhaustion. His eyes, they used to shine with an unshakable, fanatic light. Now they were blank, glassy, expressionless. Worse still, since he had returned, Arthur hadn't uttered a single coherent word. He only made meaningless, guttural sounds, and from time to time he would whisper a single word: Arthur. It was as if he had to repeat his own name over and over just to remember who he was. After Vivian brought Arthur inside, the first thing she did was try to get him into the bath. Arthur carried the dirt and heavy stench of months spent in the desert, but he resisted washing with violent desperation. He thrashed, shouted at Vivian, and flatly refused to go into the bathroom. Arthur's voice rang out, rough and deep from his throat. "Don't touch me! No water! Water calls him." Vivian was stunned. Who was he talking about? How could water harm him? Arthur only shook his head, trying to keep his sweaty, filthy face away from the bathroom. In the end, with the help of relatives, Vivian managed to force him into the bathroom, but bathing him turned into a full-blown nightmare. The moment water touched his skin, Arthur began screaming like a wild animal. He reacted as if the droplets were acid, writhing in agony. Since he had come home, the man who hadn't said a single clear word suddenly would not shut up. Rocking back and forth where he sat, he began whispering the same phrases over and over. The devil comes. The devil loves the smell. Cleanliness provokes him. At first glance, Arthur's condition looked like a mental illness, but deep down, Vivian felt it was something worse. Arthur's fanatical religiosity had been flipped on its head during that horrific journey, turning him into a servant of darkness. The first weeks after Arthur's return home were a period of sheer madness. He paced around his room night and day, constantly talking to himself. Whenever Vivian approached him, Arthur's face twisted and his voice took on a threatening tone. You're an angel," Arthur would say, but the words didn't sound like they were truly his. Vivian had never seen her husband this vicious. "Don't stop me, I'll kill you." These threats weren't just the rage of a madman. Vivian knew the hatred she saw in Arthur's eyes didn't belong to him. It was as if Arthur's soul was gone and something else had taken its place. Because no matter how fanatical he'd been before he left, he had never behaved this bizarrely. As time passed, Ilara's Aunt Vivian grew more and more afraid of her husband Arthur's behavior. Perhaps they had never been a perfectly normal family, but now their once strange little home had turned into a demonic prison. The days after Arthur's return were sleepless and terrifying for Vivian. She believed the thing roaming the house like a madman was not Arthur, but only someone who looked like him. Arthur had completely isolated himself from the family. He refused to eat, refused to bathe, and sat hunched in a corner, whispering incomprehensible things. Vivian couldn't tell anyone what was happening. Who could say, "My husband has been possessed by a demon, he encountered treasure hunting and now threatens to kill me"? She was terrified of being branded insane. But the loneliness began to eat away at her too. While this psychological torture dragged on, one night Vivian had a horrific dream. In her dream, she was in a dark corridor that stretched into infinity. At the end of the narrow, shadowy passage stood two figures identical to Arthur. The first Arthur was a silhouette radiating bright white light. His face was contorted with deep sorrow, and silent tears were running from his eyes. The luminous Arthur held out his trembling hand to Vivian and called to his wife in a weak voice, "Help me, Vivian, I'm here, I'm trapped." This was the Arthur she knew, the one she had once loved, the one who had only ever been naive, the real Arthur. The other Arthur stood beside the luminous one, a figure made of shadow, a stark contrast. His face was grim, hidden in darkness, yet lit by a malevolent grin. The red glint in his eyes was threatening. This terrifying figure stared at Vivian and whispered in a mocking voice, "He's nothing but my toy now. His soul is mine." The one speaking was the demon who had possessed Arthur while he dug for treasure in the desert. As Shadow Arthur wrapped his hand around Light Arthur's throat, the dream grew even more horrifying. Vivian wanted to scream and run, but no sound came out, and her body remained frozen where it stood. The shadow leaned close to the luminous Arthur's face and let out a monstrous laugh. "Soon, every last piece of him will belong to me," said the Dark One. Vivian woke up with a scream. She shot up in bed and wiped her forehead with her hand. She was drenched in sweat. The hair on the back of her neck was wet. Her heart was pounding against her ribs as if it wanted to burst from her chest. When something moved at the edge of her vision, Vivian looked toward the bedroom door. Her husband was standing in the doorway watching her. Arthur's face wore a grin that looked eerily like the dark Arthur's smile from her dream. His eyes weren't literally red, but the cold, piercing stare made Vivian tremble to her core. "Why are you screaming, my love?" Arthur asked, keeping that malicious grin. His voice was deeper than usual. Vivian was sure this person wasn't her husband. She had never believed in dreams, but now her belief was overpowering her rational mind. The nightmare had shown her the truth that had been in front of her all along. Two beings were fighting inside Arthur, representing his good and evil sides. The good side was imprisoned. The bad side had taken control. After that dream, Vivian's perspective changed. She no longer thought Arthur was simply mentally ill. Her husband was in the devil's hands, and saving him might cost her life. But she could no longer live in fear in her own house. And if her husband was still in there somewhere, she wanted another chance to be with him. The good part of Arthur, trapped inside him, was worth fighting for. Vivian began taking Arthur's threats against her and her loved ones much more seriously. Her niece Elara was still a little girl. Witnessing any of this could traumatize her. The only thing keeping Vivian going was the thought that she might free Arthur from this dark possession. She wanted her home to be a safe haven for her family again. Arthur's threats aside, the thought of him standing at her door at night, silently watching her, terrified Vivian even more. She had fought this battle alone for weeks. She could no longer go on like this. She set her mind on reaching out to someone she trusted, but finding professional help would not be easy. If she called the police, they'd lock Arthur in a mental hospital, which wouldn't free him from the demon. She considered calling a priest, But the fact that Arthur himself was a religious fanatic made things more complicated. After all, Vivian had never been as devout as Arthur. Desperate, Vivian began searching online for people who had experienced similar situations. She spent hours looking up terms like demonic possession, exorcism, cursed treasure. Eventually, she found the name of Dr. Elias Thorne, a former theology professor living in Texas who called himself a parapsychological consultant and dealt with such cases. Thorne was a laughingstock at the university he'd worked at, but he seemed like the only one who might take Vivian's story seriously. As soon as Vivian reached Dr. Thorne, she told him what had happened in a desperate voice. Arthur's treasure obsession, his journey to Jordan, the terrible change after his return, and finally, the nightmare she'd had. To her surprise, Dr. Thorne listened carefully and took everything she said seriously. He told her that such cases usually appeared after one interfered with cursed sites and disturbed the sleep of ancient spiritual entities. "Your husband has experienced a kind of spiritual trauma, Vivian," Thorne said over the phone. "The gold in that chest was clearly a trap. Treasure hunters looking for easy money walk straight into it. This isn't the first case like this I've heard. There was a demon imprisoned in that chest, and it has taken your husband." After hearing Vivian's story, Dr. Thorne agreed to come to North Carolina. But before he arrived, he gave her a few rules. She must not provoke Arthur, must not argue with him, and must not force him to bathe. Most importantly, she had to lock her bedroom door at night. Until Thorne arrived, Vivian had no choice but to continue living in the same house as Arthur. His condition was getting worse by the day. He was no longer just talking to himself. He wandered around the house making strange, rhythmic sounds. He had started drawing bizarre, indecipherable symbols on the walls. One night, while Vivian was on the phone with Dr. Thorne, her bedroom door suddenly burst inward, off its hinges. Vivian screamed. The shock had stolen her breath. Arthur had crashed into the room with inhuman physical strength, splintering the doorframe. His eyes were now red and more threatening than ever. "You're calling him," he hissed, his voice echoing off every corner of the room. "You betrayed me. I told you I'd kill you." The sound that came from him was too deep, too guttural to belong to any human. Arthur lunged at Vivian. With a reflex, Vivian grabbed the old metal crucifix from the nightstand and thrust it toward Arthur. The cross was a relic from Arthur's earlier faith. Sadly, he had long since lost that faith entirely. The moment the crucifix neared Arthur's bare skin, there was a horrible hissing sound and a burst of smoke. Arthur shrieked in pain and jumped back. He pressed his hand to his scorched cheek. When he pulled his hand away, the wound was visible. The skin where the cross had touched had blackened and blistered into a disgusting burn. This gave Vivian a glimmer of hope. Whatever was inside Arthur had reacted to a holy object. That meant the crucifix could keep them alive until Dr. Thorne arrived. But Vivian knew the cross couldn't protect her forever. The 2 days after Arthur's attack were like a war for Vivian. Arthur couldn't even come near the bedroom. The old iron crucifix had become a sort of poison to whatever was inside him. Vivian couldn't repair the broken door frame, but she spread plenty of salt around it and hung religious symbols all over it as a temporary safeguard. Finally, a few days later, Dr. Elias Thorne arrived in North Carolina. Thorne was an elderly man with a white beard and dark, sunken circles under his eyes. It looked as though he hadn't slept for days. In his huge satchel he carried, as he said, heavy leather-bound books and complex-looking electronic measuring devices. He was neither a priest nor a demon hunter. Dr. Thorne described himself as a scientist seeking the truth. Vivian greeted Thorne at the door with an ashamed expression, embarrassed by the house's eerie, chaotic atmosphere. Arthur had gone down to the basement a few days earlier, and the strange, muffled sounds coming from there cast a constant pall of dread over the house. Thorne wasted no time. He placed EMF, electromagnetic field, meters around the house. The devices went wild near the basement. For him, this was a clear sign. There was a high-energy, supernatural presence in the house. Vivian didn't really understand what was happening, but she had no choice but to trust Thorne. Thorne and Vivian went down to the basement. It was dim, damp, and heavy, with the stench of sulfur. Arthur sat in one corner on the bare concrete floor, his head clutched in his filthy hands. His face looked even paler and more worn than it had the last time Vivian saw him. When Arthur saw Thorne, he suddenly leapt to his feet, his eyes locked on the blessed silver medallion in Thorne's hand. "Get out, old man!" he roared. The voice that came out of him was a chorus of many, old, young, female, male. "This is mine. He's mine." Thorne stepped forward without fear. He began reading Latin phrases loudly and clearly from his leather-bound book. The words seemed to cause Arthur physical pain. He dropped to his knees, groaning in agony. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth rattled. Watching Arthur's reactions, Thorne reached a diagnosis: partial possession. Vivian looked at him in confusion. "What do you mean?" "Arthur's soul hasn't been completely destroyed," Thorne explained. "Your dream was accurate, Vivian. Two different entities are fighting inside him. One is Arthur's good side. The other is a demon, or a low-level evil spirit summoned by his greed. The treasure was a trap laid by that being." Thorne opened to a page in his book. These entities tend to haunt ancient and historic places, sites where much blood has been spilled. And such demons fear only the presence of holy things. Arthur used his religiosity for show and greed. That opened a weak spot in his soul, and the entity slipped through that empty space. The diagnosis was clear. According to Dr. Thorne, Arthur could be saved through an exorcism ritual, but it would be extremely dangerous and physically brutal. Vivian trembled with fear at this new truth, but she was ready to do anything to save her husband and herself from this nightmare. Thorne's diagnosis and instructions increased both Vivian's fear and her determination. They now knew for sure that Arthur was possessed by a demon. They had no time to waste before the demon did permanent harm to him. Thorne began preparing for the exorcism at once. The first step was to consecrate the house. Thorne took a vial of holy oil and some sea salt from his bag. With Vivian's help, he drew protective lines of salt along every door and window threshold. Using the holy oil, he drew protective symbols on the doors of the rooms where Arthur spent most of his time. During all this, Arthur screamed from the basement like a wild animal, reacting as if something were being ripped out of him. They chose the farthest, most enclosed corner of the basement as the site for the ritual. Thorne would need heavy ropes and a chair to restrain Arthur physically. "This entity will resist Vivian," Thorne warned, his voice grave. "During the ritual, you'll hear horrible words from Arthur's mouth. It will threaten you, bring up past mistakes. None of that is Arthur. It's the demon trying to break you down. Don't close your eyes, never hesitate, and no matter what, don't pity him." With a steely resolve, Vivian nodded. she would get her husband back and send the demon back to wherever it came from. Preparations for the ritual lasted until midnight. Thorn brought down a flashlight and an old, worn prayer book. Its yellowed pages were filled with Latin text. He decided to begin the exorcism exactly at 3:01 a.m. This hour is known as the dead hour, when supernatural activity is at its peak, Thorn explained. Vivian had no choice but to agree. Under the bright beams of their flashlights, Thorn and Vivian went down to the basement. They sat Arthur in a chair and tied him tightly with ropes. Arthur was almost unconscious during this. The preliminary preparations for the exorcism were apparently working. Thorn sprinkled holy water on Arthur's forehead. At that moment, Arthur's body began to convulse violently. His eyes flew open and Vivian gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. Her husband's irises had turned completely black, and on his face was that same diabolical grin from her dream. "Fools!" he roared. The voice was neither fully human nor the voice of just one man. "You dare lay hands on what's mine? This is my property. You pathetic lumps of flesh are nothing beside my power." Arthur's body strained so hard the ropes nearly snapped. Thorn wasted no time and began to pray, "Exorcismus te omnis immunde spiritus." We exorcise you, every unclean spirit. The further the prayers went, the wilder Arthur's reaction became. Suddenly, his black eyes focused on Vivian. "Vivian, I know your little secret. You think Arthur never knew you cheated on him with that man, did you? How do you think he forgave you? You're filthy too." Vivian's face went white as chalk. This was an old secret known only to her and Arthur. The demon had access to Arthur's memories, and thus to Vivian's secrets. These words were a powerful mental assault meant to break her. But Vivian remembered Thorn's warning. "This isn't Arthur." Thorn's voice grew louder. The struggle between the sacred and the dark was in full swing. Each Latin word he uttered thickened the air in the basement and made Arthur's screams even more frenzied. When the demon saw that its psychological attack on Vivian wasn't working, it turned to physical strength. The ropes groaned, the chair creaked. Arthur's eyes rolled white and a thick black fluid dripped from his mouth. The demon's voice now came in many languages at once, as strange, unintelligible whispers. "You cannot banish me. I am the guardian of the earth and the gold. I am his desire, he called me. He wanted wealth more than he wanted his own soul." Arthur's body lifted into the air. Though he was tightly bound to the chair, his feet left the ground, and for a brief moment he hung suspended. Thorn and Vivian stumbled back in shock. The display of demonic power stunned them both. Instead of panicking, Dr. Thorn raised his voice even higher. Flipping quickly through the pages, he poured holy oil generously onto Arthur's chest. Where the oil touched, smoke rose. The demon howled like a wild beast. This was proof that the real Arthur was still fighting somewhere inside. "Vivian, help me." The voice that came from Arthur's mouth suddenly shifted to the frail, pitiful tone Vivian recognized as her husband's. "Cast it out, the amulet." That desperate plea reminded Vivian of her dream, the good Arthur imprisoned. And the word amulet brought back Arthur's old piety and superstitions. For all his charlatanry, he truly believed in the power of a certain talisman he had made. Thorn had brought his own sacred objects for the ritual, but Vivian felt that Arthur's own belief system needed to be used. The amulet might not solve everything, but it could give her husband mental strength. Vivian ran upstairs and found the small leather charm Arthur had made before going to Jordan in a drawer in the living room. When the entity inside Arthur understood what she was doing, It screamed in terror. "No, it's fake. It's worthless. It has no power." "You're the one with no power," Vivian shouted back, though her jaw was trembling as she spoke. Without hesitation, she approached Arthur and pressed the amulet onto the spot on his chest where the holy oil was still smoking. The moment the amulet touched Arthur's skin, every light in the basement went out. A bright white light burst from the little leather pouch. Arthur's body convulsed violently. Then, with a dark, rumbling exhale from his mouth, the air in the basement suddenly thinned as if something had been sucked out. Arthur's eyes turned completely white, then he slumped against the chair like a statue. The rope slackened, signaling that the demon was gone. Those horrifying, nightmarish voices went silent. Thorn and Vivian were left panting in the darkness. Was it really over? The silence in the basement lasted for minutes. Thorn picked up the flashlight from the floor and shone it on Arthur. He was slumped in the chair, eyes closed, face pale, but that sinister grin was gone. Like a man finally cured of a long illness, he looked strangely peaceful. "Did we do it?" Vivian whispered, barely audible. Thorn put his hand to Arthur's neck. His pulse was weak but steady. "The entity is gone," Thorn said, taking a deep breath. "Arthur's soul is free. That amulet drew on the power of his own faith. That's a rare thing to see." They untied the ropes and carefully carried Arthur upstairs to his bed. He seemed to be in a deep coma, as if he hadn't slept in months. Vivian was utterly exhausted, emotionally, physically, everything. Through tears, she sat down beside Arthur. She had gotten him back, but at what cost? Arthur slept for 3 days. During that time, Dr. Thorn worked to cleanse the house of any remaining negative energy. He scrubbed the strange symbols off the walls with a special oil mixture. He consecrated the basement completely and sealed it. On the 4th day, Arthur woke up. Vivian was sitting beside him. When Arthur slowly opened his eyes, there was no sign of that wild, fanatical light or threat. His eyes were the eyes of the husband Vivian had lost long ago, a little tired, a little dreamy, but at least kind. "Vivian," he whispered. Vivian burst into tears. "Arthur, is it really you?" "It's me," Arthur said. What happened to me? The last thing I remember, we were opening the chest, the desert." His voice trailed off. The last memory in his mind was a horrifying blank. Arthur couldn't remember any of his time in Jordan after the chest was opened, nor the months he'd spent possessed. It was as if that entire portion of his life had been erased from his mind. When they told him what he'd done and what he'd said, Arthur could only shake his head in disbelief. "Running from the bath, telling you I'll kill you." Fear washed over Arthur's face. Was I really someone else? Vivian gently took his hand. "You're not anymore." Arthur's return wasn't exactly peaceful. His soul was free now, but everything they had been through left permanent scars behind. The first problem Vivian noticed was Arthur's mental health. Yes, he had completely given up his treasure obsession, but whenever he heard the words treasure, money, or gold, he suffered intense panic attacks. Once insanely devout, he was now afraid to even step into a church. The possession had utterly destroyed his religiosity and his old passions. He never again wrote talismans or recited prayers. He was just a quiet, fragile man. The second problem was physical. On Arthur's chest, at the spot where Vivian had pressed the amulet, a dark, burn-like scar remained. It was a mark left by the demon's resistance, a permanent brand to ensure Arthur would never forget this horror. Every time he looked at it, He remembered the price of his greed. The final problem was Vivian's own trauma. She had gotten her husband back, but the months spent under that dark threat had changed her for good. At night she would jerk awake, convinced she heard that deep, echoing voice rising from the basement. She could no longer live in that house in peace. She checked every lock, watched every shadow. When Dr. Thorne saw that Arthur had recovered physically, he decided it was time to leave. Before he left, he gave Vivian a final warning. The entity is gone, but traces of it remain in the house's memory. It will be waiting for Arthur's weak moments. Keep your eyes open. Vivian and Arthur were forced to start a new but broken life in that cursed house. They had no money to move. Arthur's unstable condition had driven away relatives and friends. They had nowhere else to go. Arthur was no longer the mad treasure hunter. He was a silent ghost, returned from darkness. And Vivian knew that Chest had buried Arthur's innocence too. Months passed. Arthur and Vivian tried to rebuild their lives from scratch. Arthur had become a quiet, obedient man. He refused to burn his treasure-hunting gear, maps, or old religious books. Instead, he stored them in the attic, wrapped in thick cloth. He wanted to bury his fear and his past, but it was clear he couldn't completely cut himself off from them either. Years later, Ilara, the young woman telling this story, went to visit her Aunt Vivian and Uncle Arthur. She couldn't believe how much Arthur had changed. The energetic wild man always making new plans was gone. In his place sat a stranger in the corner, staring into space, speaking only when forced to. Once, Ilara asked Arthur, "What did you see in Jordan, Arthur? What was in that chest?" Arthur's face turned deathly pale. In a trembling voice, he said, "Nothing, just sand, emptiness." But in his eyes, Ilara caught the shadow of a memory he was terrified to recall. Vivian did everything she could to protect Arthur, but the tension in the house never disappeared. There were strange tapping sounds from the attic, and at night a faint scent of sulfur seeped through the doorways. Thorne had been right. The entity was gone, but its traces remained. One evening, Ilara was sitting in the living room with her Aunt Vivian. That night, Vivian told her about the most terrifying threat Arthur had uttered while possessed. In the demon's voice, Arthur had said, "I'll kill you." Vivian still shook as she described that moment. "That's when I understood there were two things fighting inside Arthur, good and evil. That dream." Vivian stopped, her eyes filling with tears. Ilara listened, stunned by the trauma her aunt had endured. This was far beyond a simple family tragedy. It contradicted everything she thought she knew. Ilara and her family did not believe in the paranormal. What she heard shook her faith to the core. Her aunt had never been one to exaggerate. And then, things began to get worse again. Arthur slowly returned to his old oddities, but in a different way this time. He was no longer religious, yet he had become obsessed with rituals. At night, he went down to the basement and silently did something there. When Vivian asked what he was doing, Arthur answered only with that old empty stare and said, "Cleaning." Once, Vivian followed him. In the basement, next to Arthur's old shovels and picks, she saw fresh bags of sand. Arthur was filling a corner of the basement with new soil. The sand looked red and foreign, as if it had been brought from Jordan. "What is this, Arthur?" Vivian asked, her voice full of panic and anger. Arthur turned to her and for the first time in a long while spoke a full sentence, but his voice was deep and cold. He doesn't like the smell, but he loves the earth. The earth won't forget him. Vivian froze in horror. The entity had not completely left. In some corner of Arthur's mind, the demon's terrible command still echoed. The evil had not gone. It was only hiding,